In today's video, we're going to start a series on Infinity, the super fun miniatures game produced by Corvus Belli. And to really begin that deep dive into this world, I wanted to start with a video to kind of set the scene. I will of course be going into the background of each faction in detail, but this video is to set the groundwork for the universe itself. As with all games with this kind of like rich lore, just like I do for Age of Sigmar, it takes a lot to cover it all, right? So it's like drinking from a fire hydrant, and so what we're going to do is start simply and expand from there. The current timeline of Infinity is roughly 175 years in the future. It's a cyberpunk world of political and corporate intrigue, and mankind has reached into the stars, colonizing a full 11 planetary systems. Thanks to the discovery of and capitalization on naturally occurring stable wormholes, this has made galaxy-spanning civilizations possible. But the question is, how did we get there? And what does this kind of expansion do to humanity? And yes, in this video, I'm just going to limit it to humanity. We've discovered alien races in the Infinity timeline, but I want to lay some groundwork before I talk about them to get some context. And so in this video, we're going to do a super abbreviated, future history of Earth, right? They're historical events in terms of Infinity's timeline's future for us, starting from our current day, our current time, to the setting of Infinity. Keep in mind, the lore here is directly tied to the factions that we see in the game, and so everything I'm about to breeze through has deep and compelling lore behind it. And we'll hit all of that detail as we explore those individual factions. Also note, a lot of these things happen simultaneously, so there isn't like a real year-by-year timeline. But again, we're setting the stage for talking about those factions in some sort of context in the future. In the later half of this century that we are currently living in, the social and economic power of North America is waning. There's a lot of reasons for this. There's the energy crisis that we're on as we run low on fossil fuels, lack of technological innovation, rival global corporate interests as other nations become first world and we need to compete in the US with them. Also, at some point, the first naturally occurring wormhole was discovered, and the US, along with many countries from the EU and Russia, paid for and sent out two massively expensive colonization ships. They were going to, start gathering resources from other planets, and all of a sudden America could be on top again. But sadly, those ships were lost as the wormhole collapsed. This event darn near bankrupted the United States, and we'll explore kind of a lot more about that in just a bit. Just put a pin in this event here. Two ships went through the wormhole, but the wormhole collapsed and we marked them as lost. Understand, the colonists of at least one of those ships was not lost. It's the birth of a faction, but they won't be rediscovered till much later. The point I bring them up at them is that they exist, but they're not a player in kind of the timeline politics that we're going to talk about today. The real deal is that the US and the EU, because they were invested in that as well, is faltering. And in that vacuum of power and money, new world powers begin to rise. To the east, China becomes a full first world nation, meaning like every single part of it is a first world nation, now a near unstoppable economic giant. Because now they're one of the largest populations on the globe and it has money, they adopt a new economic system they call socialist capitalism. It's a fusion of both ideas. Because of their population and now their wealth, they grow immensely, absorbing several countries around them. And I'm just going to rapid fire here them. North Korea, Mongolia, Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Taiwan, Nepal, and Bhutan. And since America is in such a rough place, the United States of America is such a rough place, countries that had invested heavily in the US also get hit. And China is there to sweep them up and buy them out of their debt. So namely, Japan and South Korea. This massive, Pan-Asian alliance has problems though. They don't all want to be Chinese, right? That China is the epicenter of all of this. It's absorbing and kind of pulling everything in its gravity, but those are a bunch of separate countries that have their own heritage and traditions and things like that. And so the solution that China puts forward is to create a new identity. And in that moment, Yu Jing is born. all the countries here become regions of a single power, a new identity that blankets yet respects the differences of older traditions. It unifies the East and galvanizes them into a single power. They have money, manufacturing, and a singularity of purpose. They become, collectively, Yujing. Now, like I said, a lot of what we're talking about today happens simultaneously, so let's rewind and reset the current era that we're now in, and we'll do another timeline going forward. This time we're going to look at Australia and New Zealand. Those two countries are seeing all the stuff go down in Asia, right? They're seeing China, just this awakening of commercialism and manufacturing potential and that kind of stuff, and they start to worry. Remember, all the changes in the birth of Yujing, they took a lot of time, and so people are responding in real time. And they're seeing all those countries that I listed off getting gobbled up by the sheer economic influence of China. Well, Australia and New Zealand see this and understand they need to do something to resist being consumed, right? Because if China grows so big that they can control all that trade, all of a sudden Australia and New Zealand, they're in a bad way. They'll have to capitulate and join Yujing just to kind of stay afloat because there's no other trade options for them. And so they go to their longtime commercial rivals, Indonesia and Malaysia, and form their own kind of a union. They saw the European Union working, but it's in a bad state because of the space race and all that stuff, so they made their own. And they do this with incredible success. Those four countries are able to unify and work together like never before, and soon they end up on equal footing with the faltering United States. After that, the Philippines are admitted into this new union of nations, and then a big one happens, India. And then the South American giants of Brazil and Chile, where Yujing achieved this superpower status by dominating its smaller neighbors and unifying those cultures. This new union, named Pan-Oceania, or PANO for short, focuses on unity through mutually beneficial political and economic might. Nobody wants to be consumed by China, so they work together. But then they realize we can expand. We can make this one of the first truly global unions. Because it doesn't get more global than Australia, India, and Chile, right? Those are just total different parts of the map. Not like Yujing, which was just China absorbing its neighbors. Where the Yujing is conservative but consistent in its expansion, Pan-Oceania spread like a wildfire because it used the resources of countries that were previously tied to the US like never before. It's much quicker to react and expand on global political changes than Yujing, and it was really the dominant power in the what we'll call the second space race, right? The first space race was like who could get to space, period. The second one being who can colonize another planet. It was the scientists of Pan-Oceania who discovered more stable wormholes. They were the first of these new powers to colonize other planets, and they have colonized more than any other. Like I said, there are 11 worlds. They own most of them. And we'll dive into this more when we cover Pan-Oceania in their dedicated video, but in short, it's much more of the traditional cyberpunk vision of the future. They leveraged the failure of the powers of our day, brought out their tech and their best things, and charted a new course into the future. Yujing is their main competitor, hot on their heels with the number of planets colonized, and just the size of their population and markets and economic power. Those are the two biggins. Okay, so those are two factions that are in Infinity, and that's very, very briefly their birth. Now let's hop into our rewind machine again, whoop, 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 and we'll head back to Earth in our current time, but we're going to go to the Middle East. Now, of course, this is an area that has been historically, been rife with conflict, right? But from there, Haq Islam, meaning New Islam, is a philosophical concept born in this area in the latter half of this century. It's a revitalization of Muslim beliefs, but with a renewed focus on humanism and the never-ending search for knowledge. And I'm talking about knowledge in the philosophical sense, right? And it means everything. It's art, science, medicine, technology, literature, education, wisdom. Think of this movement that we call Haq Islam as a second renaissance of humanity. And it has its foundation on Muslim principles. They are not radicalized or violent. A lot of these miniature games, they have the quote-unquote the religious faction that is very zealots and they're not like that at all. Instead, they seek peace. When they need power to effect change, they do so through economic and political means. And the demonstration of this peace and this lifestyle really took a hold of the Middle East, because soon politicians of multiple Middle Eastern countries were elected that were Haqq Islamites, and they naturally worked together, and slowly the region reached a loose unity, right? I mean, there's still problems, there's a lot of heritage and warfare going on, but they kind of reached this equilibrium, if you will. The problem is, Haqq Islam at this point in our story is like a theological and philosophical movement. It's not a nation. They don't have their own land, and none of those big powers I mentioned before are going to just give them some. And so they looked to the stars. Backed by incredibly wealthy donors and political leaders, they found themselves a stable wormhole. There's a cool story behind that I'll touch on in their lore. But on the other side of this wormhole, there is a single habitable planet, which they named Borak. And with that, Haqq Islam went from a belief to becoming a nation. The faithful spreading across the stars, along with the other powers as they set up, bases and diplomacies and that kind of stuff. But their new home was on Borak. From there, they have dominated the market on medical technology, trade, and transportation. Just like on Earth, their power and relevance comes from an economic standpoint that aligns with their humanist principles. And what was once a new belief system based on a specific religion, some of their texts, has become more of a cultural value system of a galaxy-spanning nation. So don't think of, when you hear Haqq Islam, a society of religious zealots, but instead, it's a full independent nation with different peoples and subcultures within it. So in our story, we're beginning to transition from, our timeline, you and I in our world, to the current era in Infinity. But we've covered 3 superpowers that are all clamoring for resources among the stars, and there's no laws to govern how that's done. At this point in our story, the O12 is born. Think of this as a United Nations, but with more power and more decision-making ability. O12 establishes claim rights for nations, how trade is conducted lawfully, it keeps the peace in check, and allows nations to kind of air their grievances and more. It's kind of this web between all the nations and superpowers that keeps things in check, at least in theory. Well, when a wormhole that led to the planet known as Dawn was discovered, O12 became important. I'm gonna slip this in here because it displays the importance of O12. At this point in the story, we learn that the 2 colonial ships that went through from the US and parts of Russia and parts of the European Union, what we marked as lost, it caused all the financial collapse that really kind of spurred on some of these superpowers. Well, we learned at this point that it was only the second ship that was actually lost. The first one, the Ariadne, actually made it to their destination, this planet known as Dawn. And the descendants of the Ariadne have fought fiercely to stake out a life on this planet. There's a lot to cover when it comes to Ariadne. It's a very compelling story, actually one of my favorite sci-fi things out there. And it really does require its own dedicated video, but I'm going to give you a super quick version. And that really starts with the idea that the different nations that filled the ship, right? You have the US, Russia, parts of the French military, I believe, and then there's also a Scottish detachment, that kind of stuff. Well, they formed these individual nation states upon the planet of Dawn, and each of them adapt to the planet's environment differently, but they also retained a lot of their unique quirks. So they feel different individually, but when you kind of zoom out, you can see how they'd work together. The planet, though, Planet Dawn, is rich in a rare resource that all the other powers want, and so a conflict ensued over colonization rights, right? Here's the question. The ship was marked as lost. Who owns the Ariadne now that it was refound? Is it the people who bought the debts of the US? Or do they have property rights to this thing that we all thought was gone? Are they even an identified nation state? Why don't we just come down there and just take whatever we want from them? This isn't the crew of the Ariadne, this is their descendants. It's been a long time that they've been out of contact. They were kind of given up for lost, and likewise, the people of the Ariadne thought they were abandoned. These are like frontier-type folks being reintroduced to their own species after a lot of changes. And so this seemed like a great place to slip in Ariadne in O12 because it was O12 that stepped in and said, no, like, we're going to stop. We're going to leave the planet alone. The planet Dawn belongs to the Ariadnans. They identified Ariadne, meaning all of the different, subtypes of people, the US Ariadne, the Caledonians, which is the Scottish type folks. Collectively, they are Ariadne as a people group, and they are recognized as a power of their own right, and their rights to the planet were reserved, becoming the last planet and people group to enter the human sphere, which is kind of a catch-all term for humanity. Again, can't stress enough, there's a lot of detail in that particular, we'll call it a side quest story arc, that I'm very excited to get into. Because their technology and advancement is kind of frozen in time from a long time ago, meaning our future, but infinity's past. And that puts them behind the 8 ball, but they also have the resources that everybody and their mom wants. So it's this kind of cool setup for neat stories. Plus they got werewolves and stuff like that. We'll talk about it. There's all kinds of cool things about Ariadne. But, we're kind of collecting all these different people groups and ideologies and that kind of stuff. Here's a question for you. How does a galaxy-spanning species full of individual nations and superpowers work? This is where we introduce Aleph, the near-omnipotent artificial intelligence that makes this setting possible. Aleph regulates the market, transportation, terraforming, air traffic control, eventually managing political processes itself. It is the ultimate big brother, right? The artificial intelligence that mankind, in all its forms, relies on for this kind of existence with this level of complex technology. Aleph is actually a playable faction in the game, because the intelligence system here understands that sometimes you need to have hands and feet to get a job done. And so this race of meta-humans was developed, and there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm very excited to get to that video. But the birth of Aleph leads right into the final faction that we're going to cover today, and that is the Nomads. There are 3 massive spaceship colonies that form the Nomad Nation, if you can kind of call it that. I mean, it is a nation. Simply put, these are people who rejected the total control of an artificial intelligence or just disagree with O12 for various reasons. They are self-imposed outcasts, but still contribute and work alongside the others, like the other superpowers. And in fact, O12 does acknowledge them as a political power, which infuriates Pan-Oceania and Yujing, who see the Nomads as major facilitators of black market deals and illegal trade, and admittedly, that's exactly what they do. These are the bad boys and girls of the setting. So let's kind of pause here, step back, and ask ourselves, why is this cool? As I mentioned numerous times, there's so much that I glossed over. This truly is an introductory video, loosely covering the timelines and how the factions, at least the human ones, came to be. As we look at them individually, which we're going to do in different videos, you'll see that all of them are this really cool action and reaction to one another. It builds in this way that makes sense. It seems like a believable vision of the future, complete with evil corporations, new definitions of philosophy and religion, unbridled technology, and people who are just opposed to all of it. It's a messy universe where diplomatic relations and resource claiming and businesses meet. And you might be thinking to yourself, this doesn't sound like a miniatures skirmish game. This kind of seems something more like Risk, where big nation states are fighting against each other and that kind of thing, and I get that. But all of this drama, the fight for resources, space, colonization, corporate espionage, all of that is the perfect setup for this miniatures game, because fun fact, Code Infinity is the name of the danger level immediately before open war. In America, we have the DEFCON alert, right? How much danger are we in? How much fear should we perpetually be in? All that stuff like that. Well, they have a series of code names for this threat, and Infinity is this one. This pits tactical specialists of each nation against one another, all of them fighting to maintain control, territory, intellectual property, technology, research, all that stuff. But they don't want to make the house of cards that humanity has built fall by risking open war. Instead, they opt for covert missions by select professionals to achieve these goals. And I like that. I like the covert thing, covert ops going in to steal and defend something, but both sides understand we can't let this go public. We aren't at war, It's kind of almost more like this is gang turf wars just magnified to a crazy scale. Interplanetary, international, with crazy sci-fi weapons. It's a really neat deal. It's an awesome concept and I'm falling in love with the game. I reached out to the guys at Corvus Belli and they're super cool. And this year the game is looking at getting its new edition. I believe it's going to be at Adepticon 2020. And there's some different like side ways to get in that make it easier to start than ever. So I hope you all check it out. And come back here as we kind of explore the setting and the various factions, because I can't stress enough, really, honestly, how much I skimmed over. All these factions have individually, I'm going to reiterate some of their stuff, but it's so much deeper than what I went through here. It's cool, I'm stoked, and I hope that you're stoked too. So let me know your thoughts down below. Do you play Infinity? And if so, would you mind sharing this video and telling me, right? Tell me what your favorite faction is and why, and I look forward to seeing you in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching, and happy wargaming.